From the Income Protection Journal, you're listening to the Income Protection Journal podcast with Jamie Fleischner.
My guest today has been in the disability insurance business since 1986. He has spent 14 years as a vice president of disability insurance sales and marketing at one of the country's largest carriers. And he is now the president of the Council for Disability Income Awareness, the nonprofit organization whose mission is to make sure more working Americans understand what income protection is before they need it. He has spent the last 2.5 years rebuilding that organization into something that now reaches nearly 40,000 agents and advisors with free resources, tools, and campaigns designed to get more people asking the right questions about their financial safety net. Here is Bob Herum, and this is Disability Insurance Awareness Month. There's no better time for this conversation. So, Bob, welcome to the Income Protection Journal podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it and appreciate the kind words. So 40 years is a little scary, though. I don't like to admit to that always.
It goes by quickly. It really does. So, I'm going on 33 years. I still can't believe it. It's really hard to believe sometimes. So, but I wanted to point out, so you have a watercolor painting hanging in your hallway. It's painted by a disabled doctor who wasn't quite covered as well as he should have been. And he started selling his artwork to supplement his disability benefits. Can you tell me about that painting and what it has come to mean to you?
Sure. It was interesting. I started my career coming out of the military after 8.5 years on active duty into this strange thing called disability income insurance, which was the last thing I ever would have thought I'd be doing. And one of the interesting things at Provident at that point was that the checks came to our office. And so we would oftentimes I would literally deliver those checks to the insureds. And in other cases, they would actually come to the office. And I remember talking to my manager one day. I said, why do they want to come to the office? And he said, Bob, we're their bank. Okay, we're the only monies that are coming in at this point. And this doctor who had some type of neurological issue that took him out of his surgical duties, thought he was covered. And at one point he probably was, but as his income kept going up, things didn't stay in place and he didn't add additional coverages. And so, as you just said, he was supplementing his income, cash and carry, by doing watercolors. And that story really struck me. And there were several similar stories that happened early in my career that took me from a salesperson to someone that had a passion to talk about what we're talking about today. The biggest concern I have is most people do not plan, and their lack of planning becomes their plan. And so that's why I appreciate this forum so much.
Yeah. So maybe tell us another story, maybe one that also really struck you, like that moment where you're thinking you're helping people to knowing you're really helping people.
Yes, I had moved from Birmingham, Alabama up to Columbus, Ohio, was the assistant manager of an office there. And it was a poorly operating office. And so one of the things that I had been taught through my sales training was to go out and seek endorsements or sponsorship by various professional organizations. And so the Columbus Dental Society was headquartered right there in Columbus, Ohio, which is the capital, which is where typically those headquarters are located. And I met, again, an individual that came into the office to pick up his check, and I brought him into my office. We were sitting there and talking, and it was interesting because he also had a neurological issue, ended up with surgery, on his brain, and it took him out of his actual practice of working in people's mouths, and he had evolved his practice into buying other practices. And every time he brought a new dentist on, one of the very first things he did was he said, you need to call Bob Herum at XYZ company. And they would come in, and he just had a passion because he was, again, one of those individuals that knew his agent, who was a friend of mine, had talked him into it, but reluctantly talked him into it, which is often the case, and sort of said, you need to do this. And that passion played out. later, he actually called me one day after I'd left the company and moved on to another opportunity. And the carrier that had taken over the coverages was actually putting him through, various types of things, trying to say potentially that he was working in his own occupation. And he was very successful. We talked about it, and he worked with the claims person and worked out that while he was still in dentistry, he was no longer actually practicing dentistry. But again, that just struck me because that's, especially in the higher income, the professional trades, when a person buys that own occupation coverage, oftentimes they really don't know what that means. And so a contract that actually included his own occupation, but also within that, the specialty. He's not working on people's mouths. He's managing different dental offices around Central Ohio. And so, again, those kinds of things really taught me to read the contracts. And I'm sure we'll get into Group LTD. And I spent 10 years marketing Group LTD, and I have a lot of passion for Group LTD. But I also think you need to know the what it does and maybe some of the things it doesn't do so well. And again, that's part of that focus on know what you have and ensure what you have is sufficient so that you're not surprised when you wake up one day and something just isn't going right.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, the person with the watercolor, make sure it stays up to date, because you might buy it early in your career. And if you tuck it away and never increase it or adjust it as your needs change, it becomes less valuable.
Well, it's amazing because one of the first things I was taught when I took the insurance exams was the need for an annual review. And I oftentimes wondered how many times annual reviews actually occur. And I'm sure many times the insured says, I don't need it. But I also wonder sometimes, are we asking enough time? Maybe it doesn't need to be done annually, but certainly
regularly.
Yeah, frequently.
So you've described your goal with the CDIA and throughout your career, not as getting everyone to buy disability insurance, but as helping people make a conscious decision. So what does an unconscious decision look like, and why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, the unconscious decision that many people, probably most people, make is the fact that they hear the story, they do understand that disability can happen to them, but they don't believe it's ever going to happen to them personally. It's going to be somebody down the street. And so the unconscious decision is made by those people that are offered a benefit, whether the employer pays part of it or it's totally voluntary, and they simply make no decision. They don't act on it. They don't really, they don't take it to their spouse. They don't have, any time to really talk about it with a professional advisor. And so they make that unconscious decision, which eventually at some point in time may come back and cost them. My desire and the whole purpose of the CDIA, besides providing tools for the agents and brokers and benefit reps that actually are the front line of communicating the need for disability income planning, is that people will actually take a conscious decision and look at what their employer provides, look at what they currently have, be realistic about the fact that their savings that might take years and years to accumulate can be wiped out in a matter of months during disability. And the fact that while most people do recover and are able to go back to work, not everyone is able to go back to work. And then the final thing is that I want them to confront those things that they'll say to that agent. And I've heard, hundreds of times through the years, my wife will go back to work. Well, when was the last time she worked? We're going to use savings. Well, how many months could you go on your savings? I'm going to move back into my parents. Do your parents know that? I'm going to borrow money. Well, tell me the bank that's going to lend you those types of monies. I was actually reminded, I was sitting here before this began, and I was looking at something that we used to hand out. Actually, Paul Revere used to hand them out to their brokerage reps. But it's basically just building blocks, and it shows all the things that people have to pay for, cars, homeowners insurance, health insurance. And across the bottom, it spells income, because everything is predicated off of their ability to earn an income. And I'm going to be writing a blog about this when I'm on the cruise ship next week, because I think sometimes the simplest messages are those that resonate most with individuals.
Exactly. Exactly. So 2.5 years ago, you stepped in to lead this organization, and it was going through a really difficult period. So what did you see when you arrived, and what did you focus on first?
Oh, yeah, actually, true story. One day sitting here, get a phone call from a former boss saying, "Hey, we have an issue at the CDA at that point, Council for Disability Awareness." And the president, who was somebody that I knew and had worked with for years, being on various committees at the CDA, was having a recurrence of a significant health issue, and they just didn't know what was going on. She somewhat pulled back from communication, and so the question was, "Bob, if we need you, will you step in?" And I said, "Obviously, I have a lot of passion for this, as hopefully you can tell." The very next day, they called and said she passed. Okay, so it was very, very shocking. And it's no one's fault, but the fact is that during that long goodbye, and it was about a year's worth of long goodbye, a lot of things just stopped happening, which is very normal. Small organizations like the CDA or CDIA now, they're two or three deep. The bench strength is not there. And while she was incredibly creative and a real driving personality, when she pulled back because of this, which I think anyone would in those situations, that affected the association dramatically. A lot of people stopped hearing from the CDA, and what had happened was about half a dozen carriers had actually non-renewed. Okay, and in a 503C organization, membership is key to survival. Okay, and so when I came on board, it was not ideal, but in some ways it was, because it was almost a blank slate. Okay, there were obviously some very strong programs, the weekly blogs that they were producing, outstanding material, primarily written by the member firms, but that was about it. Okay, the research hadn't happened for a period of time. The marketing organizations, I sat in on both those groups, and the term I used was, I could hear the crickets. There was not a lot of communication. Okay, and so being a somewhat driven individual, okay, I started challenging. Why aren't more people on those calls? Why aren't you commenting? Silence does not mean that you agree. It just means you're silent. Okay.
Yeah.
We also ended up having what I call blue sky meeting, a couple months after I came on board. And I had used those for years in other organizations where, let's just, big bulletin boards, in a new world now, it's, all done online. But it was like, there's no dumb idea. What are we doing that we need to do more of? What are we doing that is not creating any value? What ideas sort of off left field should we be considering? And that really was the impetus of our moving forward. Mm-hmm. And we've had 2 additional meetings, and we continue to focus on what we can do in the future.
So to recap, you were talking about, so when you came on, you took over and it was really just a blank slate. And so lost some members.
That's not criticism of my predecessor. She was going through, a life and death situation, and none of us really knows how we might react to those types of things. But it also meant that I was constrained by things that were being done, and felt I felt open to questioning what we were doing, where our focus was, and I also wanted to do a lot more things. My view on the CDIA and almost anything is, if 1 or 2 things will help improve it, half a dozen things will improve it more. Mm-hmm. And so I discovered that we had, at one point, I thought we had 3 dysfunctional websites, Turned out we had 4 dysfunctional websites. First board meeting I had was we need to have a awesome website presence. And so that became one of their very first priorities. I saw after sitting in on some of those, the marketing and the research committees where they were poorly attended, very little communication back and forth, challenged the carriers to put people on those committees that were interested and had a passion for what we're doing, and started, we're going to use those committees, which are made up of the member firms, to help drive our future state. And we went from hearing crickets to having 60-minute meetings every Friday, and for the most part, almost every member is present unless they have some other reason that they can't be there. The same thing was true of the marketing materials to support the agents. We had done a decent job of those types of things, but in many cases, the materials were dated. They hadn't been updated periodically. And sometimes it's hard to find good data in order to update those. But we created marketing relationships with IDIS, IBI, the reinsurers, to get better data so that the materials that we prepare, primarily for DM, but they're used 12 months out of the year by the agents and brokers and benefit reps, were outstanding in material, good looking, timely, and accurate. And
so it sounds like you also expanded from not just working with the companies, but also with BGAs and agents as members. So maybe kind of tell us how that came about.
Sure, yeah. And certainly I actually ran across something from Barry Lundquist, who was a president, two individuals.
Sure.
And he had actually written a white paper as he left the CDIA. And Barry and I were quite close, but I never saw the white paper. That went to the board. But one of the things he had suggested was look at the membership and see whether it should be expanded. And so I did, as I got ready to retire at the end of 2021, I was asked by Carol, my predecessor, what do you think we need to do to further our influence? And I recommended in a written communication that I thought we needed to involve the BGAs and agencies that focus on disability income insurance, because most insurance now is funneled through those BGAs. And in many cases, the carriers that used to have, sales offices around the country, in many cases have moved to more of a 1-800 call the home office for that type of support. And that's not true across the board, but there were a lot less carriers marketing disability income insurance since the 90s, which was sort of the heyday of disability. And then the carriers not having the number and breadth of sales representatives across the country had also impacted who was educating and training the agents. When I got in the business, there were 300 carriers that marketed disability insurance. A lot of mutual companies were out there, small mutuals, but they had DI to help create a broad portfolio for their agents. Well, they had all left the DI arena in the mid-90s. And so I wrote this memo, retired, was sort of doing a little consulting gig. And when the phone call came about stepping back into the CDIA or CDA at that point, and one of the first questions I asked was, what happened to that memo? And they said, oh, the board approved it. I said, what happened? Well, nothing happened. Okay. It again, for a lot of reasons, it had gone nowhere. So we are actually, we now have Munich Re as a member. And just think of what the amount of information that the reinsurers have. And so we're talking to 2 or 3 other reinsurers, both on the group and on the individual disability.
That's great.
We also opened it up to the BGAs and agencies. And, just recently, the DI Broker East out of Boca Raton came on board. The Plus Group is out there, Ash Brokerage. I mean, these are major shops. And in most cases, they're really the back door or the the way that most agents are communicated with. But one of our newest ones, Steve Henney from KME, he had indicated an interest when he called. We were talking. I said, why are you so interested in becoming a member? And he goes, whenever I have an agent that says I need training materials or I need more information, I send them to the CDIA website because there's so much data and information out there, and it's being updated literally weekly by our marketing firm. And so it has actually infused a great deal of enthusiasm by these BGAs because they're the front and center. They're talking to agents, on a daily basis. And one of the, I'm not going to do many statistics, but the one statistic that just concerns me, and part of the reason I have so much passion for this discussion, is that in my prior life, we were trying to figure out why don't more agents sell disability income insurance? And I don't care whether it's an individual product, group, a voluntary or worksite product, just why aren't they selling it? Because the statistic I heard was that 4 out of 100 agents that have a life and health license, and you need a health license for disability in almost all states, sell disability income insurance. 4 out of 10. Or
that 4 out of 100, that just boggles my mind, which means 96% of the people that are out there talking to clients about protecting their families, financial planning, are not doing their job properly, in my estimation.
Yeah, now, and it's sort of insidious when you think about it, because every carrier, life insurance carrier, and let's face it, most agents have an affiliation for their life sales, but they'll have fact finders. And on that fact finder, there's a place to indicate, do you have disability income insurance? If you have, is it group, is it individual, whatever. And they go through that. And there's probably in almost every case a delta. There's a deficit here, and but I think there's different reasons for it. Number one, most agents aren't very well trained. Again, that's why we're focusing on the BGAs and the agencies to try to and creating those materials to help them. They may be afraid that they're going to mess up their life sale. The disability underwriting is different than life insurance. It's not. I've never thought it's. I'm 71.
I think that's
old.
A myth, actually.
Yeah,
I don't think it's that
I'm
much
71
different.
years old. I'd still get a policy. They put an exclusion on my knee. I know that. But other than that, I think I'm still insured.
I think that's a myth. I think, yeah.
But I mean, I'm sort of saying, when I ask that question, and it's funny. I think the biggest concern, though, is that they see group coverage 60%, and they stop. Okay, you've got it covered. And again, I spent 10 years of my life marketing group LTD, group STD, voluntary disability, and then for 4 or 5 years actually managed sales offices across the country in those for those types of products. And the fact is that very few people that have group LTD have actually ever read the certificate of insurance, have actually reviewed it. In the old days, before internet and PDFs and everything else, I'd say, give me a copy of it. And when I'd sit down with that professional and I'd say, do you realize it's 60% of base earnings and only the income that comes from the hospital, not your personal practice? Do you realize that the portion that's paid for by the employer is federal income taxed? Do you realize that if you leave that employer, that stays with the company? It doesn't travel with you. And so to me, it was never a question of whether you sell life insurance or disability income insurance. It was you do both. Because if they have the car accident and they die, the family's going to need some form of income for some period of time as they move on from your death. If you live through that, you're probably still going to need some monies to help you during a recovery, whether that's months or years. And so, again, it's disturbing, and again, that's part of the reason the CDIA exists, is to question those, and frankly, to be a conduit of information to the various trade organizations and to publications to make sure that they're talking about this also, because it's sort of that hidden insurance, which is crazy when you think about it.
And that's what I was going to say. So May is Disability Insurance Awareness Month. And I think it's great getting the word out to the public that this is needed. But as you and I both discuss, every day should be Disability Insurance Awareness Day. So what is the CDIA doing? Like you mentioned, there's resources, but maybe talk a little bit more in depth. What is the CDIA doing to help the general public to create awareness about the importance of income protection?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a great question, because for 20 years of our existence, I'm sure the mission statement has always been about educating working Americans about his or her need for disability income insurance for themselves and their family. In my view is that we've done a poor job on that part of the mission statement. We've always had good tools for the agents and producers, but the question was, what do you do to get in front of the individuals? And so one of our most recent Blue Sky meetings, which happened in January of this year, was how do we take on that elephant? Okay, because it's a big elephant, and step one was getting a viable website. CDIA now has an extremely powerful website with lots of materials, not just for agents and brokers, but for that working American. And we're actually adding tools that are designed to help that individual that goes to our website, sort of uncover that, okay, I've got group LTD. Am I totally covered? Do I need additional? So we're actually working on a video right now that'll be designed for the working American. We're doing something similar for the agent and producer, because many of them, if they haven't been trained, person says they've got group LTD, they check the box. Okay, they're good to go, whether they are or aren't. You mentioned earlier, and we have a 40,000 person agent broker database that we're now doing monthly reach outs to the agents and brokers. On the working American side, it's a little more difficult, but what we are now creating are videos that are actually designed for those individuals to have them look and again, ask the question, do I have coverage? What do I have? Do I have enough? And there are certain industries, certain size industries that almost never have group LTD. Think of the small, 2 to 10 person marketplace, or even 10 to 25, 35 employees. Oftentimes they do not have anything, and yet they don't know the questions to ask. And so what we're trying to do is to give them those types of questions so that when they sit down with their employer and they say, well, what do we have? Well, maybe there's paid medical family leave. Maybe there's a sick pay program. Maybe there's short term. What do you have at the end of 90 days? Those types of questions that they should be asking. And one of the things we're actually trying to do right now, in fact, we're just rolling it out as we speak, is we have a program to recognize employers that provide a superior disability program for their employees. It's called the employer.
Oh, wow. So somebody can say, I work at Google, and they can see what they have on your website.
That's right. And we're actually, we give them a certificate. We give them something to put on their intranet to show that they've been selected by the CDIA as a firm that provides a superior disability program. And
what do you consider a superior disability program versus a standard one?
We have some criteria. Do they have short term? Do they have long term? It has to be a meaningful amount of coverage. So I think we've said 50% plus. Most LTD out there is at 60 or even 66 and 2/3. But we're just trying to make sure that the person, there's sick days, there's different periods of time that, most short term does not start on the very first day for an accident. Many of them are 7-day or 14-day elimination periods. What do they have during those that first week? So do they have a continuum of coverage that can take them through whatever might happen to them that might take them out of the workplace? And so
So you're
again,
creating a resource. So if somebody is, maybe they're interviewing at a couple of places, they're looking at jobs and they want to say job A, job B, job C, these different employers, they could come to the website and say which of these are going to have the best benefits package, essentially.
we haven't done it yet, but we just had our first certificate awarded last week. But we will be updating that on a quarterly basis. All the employers that have been recognized for meeting that criteria.
And how do you reach out to? Do you reach out to those employers, or do they know to contact CDIA?
Well, we're actually working through the member carriers of the CDIA. Okay, and there's a whole packet of information about the program, and literally Unum, which helped introduce this idea to us when they came back on to the CDIA last year, is actually the first one that's marketing it, and it's sort of a soft launch at this point. We want to make sure we've got all the bugs worked out. But just a week and a half or so ago, we had our board meeting. We took it to the entire board and made sure that they all have the information. And again, since we have Principal, we have Unum, we have Lincoln Financial, we have some of the biggest insurance carriers in the group marketplace out and individual marketplace out there. We think this is going to be sort of a game changer, and we also think it's going to be picked up and highlighted by various financial journals as something, as you said, to ask those types of questions when you're taking employment. You mentioned job A, job B, job C. The very first sales idea I ever was handed to me, which was a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, was, which job do you want, job A or job B? And back then, I think it was 100,000 of income or 95,000 of income and a disability policy that would continue 60% of your income for the rest of your working career. Stupidly simple sales idea, but again, some of those old sales ideas were really good sales ideas, and it got a person thinking. We recently did a series of videos right there in Portland, Maine, where our marketing firm is, where they did what I call person on the street videos. And they would actually walk up to Jamie and they'd say, Jamie, if you were out of work for 90 days, what would you do? And they're open, the eyes would open up and there'd be this, sort of, look off to the side. And it's interesting because when I said I wanted to do more of that, the comment was, they're rough, they're not clean, they're not, it's
but
not.
I think that's really powerful, going up to people on the street and asking them this basic question: if you weren't able to work the next 6 months, 9 months, what's your plan? Because I think most people don't have an answer.
No, and in fact, that's what the videos are powerful, because they are real people on the street. They do not have a canned response. In most cases, there's a long silence, and then, we're a two-income family. I guess we would cut back one person I watched a couple of them yesterday. I guess I'd be moving home. Again, all the normal things that those of us that have been in front of a client when we ask that question. What's interesting, and I have not rehearsed this, but I was told by my very first boss that when you're meeting with a client, you need to find their blister. And I remember going, what do you mean? He goes, what's their pain point? Okay. And he also said, and being salespeople, we tend to love hearing ourselves talk. But he stressed the importance, and it's something I've worked hard on for the last 40 years, of asking lots of questions. The more they talk, they're actually telling you how to approach getting them to make a conscious decision whether to buy or not buy. Again, the worst one, I always said, I actually would tell a proposed insured when I'm sitting in front of you, it's okay to have objections. I want objections, okay? In fact, I would even suggest, here are some objections you should maybe give to me. It costs too much, I don't need whatever, because then I know where they are in their thought process. Silence does not give you much of an indication. And typically, what many agents, I think, are, they get the proposal, they just sort of want to get up and leave where now's the time to be asking, what are your concerns, and
Yeah.
get those
Well,
concerns.
I've always said that I don't think you can like sell disability insurance. You can't convince somebody. You have to help people understand their risk and their need, and you walk them along to help them solve their problem. That's
Yeah.
the most important part about income protection. It's not being sold something,
No,
because
no.
that's
In
not
fact,
going to
no one
last.
wants to
It's
be sold. It's
no, no.
I mean, think of, I always I wanted to treat people the way I wanted to be treated in the sales process.
Mhm.
I don't need the car salesman going back. Let me talk to my manager whether I can get the rust proofing for free. I wanted an
Yeah.
honest relationship with the person. And in fact, whenever I'm working on, thinking about buying something, it's, listen, I was in sales for years. Just lay it out to me. There's a cost, there's benefit. What does that ratio look like? It's interesting because I think if you're that type of salesperson, even if you don't make the sale immediately, you may plant some seeds and get that follow-on phone call. More importantly, you're going to feel like you've at least done your job of
Yeah.
communicating the need.
And I actually think, I mean, you and I are both so passionate about disability insurance. And I think one of the most important things is just really educating Americans, educating agents, educating everybody, because if you truly understand what happens to somebody when they can't work, it seems like a very important solution. It's very simple. And I think the reason that 96% of these people aren't talking about it to other people is because maybe they're not fully aware of what happens. Maybe they're afraid to talk. These are really uncomfortable, difficult conversations, but they're necessary. And everybody should be talking about it.
Well, think about it. In your preface, you said, that the target audience here is a more highly compensated professional marketplace. But how many times have you met with a physician that can't imagine themselves being disabled? And I'd say, every day you walk through a hospital, every one of these rooms is filled with people that really were not planning to be in here for you to see them on their rounds. The attorneys that would envision, I'd say, well, if you became disabled, well, as long as I have my mental faculties and my voice, I can continue to work. And
Yeah, but I have attorneys that have had brain tumors or have
yeah,
had all kinds of problems, or they're going through chemotherapy and they can't work. And
yeah, no,
so it's
well,
really,
again, I think we're hardwired to push back. I mean, we really do think when you turn 60 plus, like I am, you do learn that knees hurt. Things don't work quite the way they did when I was 30 or whatever. And so, but the problem is that by the time you get to my age, you can't buy this stuff. You need to buy it when you have the health so that if something happens to you. Part of the reason, you mentioned that we had been called the CDIA, Council for Disability Awareness, and one of my first recommendations was to add the word income to it. And the reason being is we had people that were coming out to our website and they would, click and ask a question, and they had become disabled and they wanted to know what services we might
they
provide.
needed resources. Yes.
Needed
It's too
resources.
late.
Yeah, and I always said, listen, we'll try to help you as much as we can. In fact, I have a vision of someday being able to have on our website, you live in Iowa, you get disabled, what does the state provide? What does federal have? What do you have through work, whatever? But the bottom line is we need to be talking to people before that significant event happens. And, again, statistics, we all use statistics too often, but, something that was true in 1986 when I first saw it come out of Gen Re. And it was true last year when Milliman did a recent report, but when 1 out of 4 working Americans will have at least a 90-day disability during his or her working career, this is not an esoteric discussion. This is actually, I mean, if I knew that there was a 25% chance that when I crossed the road, I was going to get hit by a car, I probably wouldn't cross the road. I mean,
or get on that airplane or whatever. Yeah, take that risk. Absolutely.
And so again, I remember when I purchased my first disability income policy, it was sort of the same feeling I had when I purchased my first life insurance policy, outside of work. It was like, okay, if something happens, my family's squared away.
Hmm.
If something happens, we keep the house.
Hmm.
We can still go out to dinner. We don't have to downsize. We don't have to, those types of things. It was
But
sort of,
there's something to be said for having that kind of peace of mind, because I have people say to me, well, what happens when I get to age 65 and I don't, I cancel the policy and I'm retired? And I said, well, congratulations.
yeah, you
You
just won the
didn't
lottery.
use it, but you had that peace of mind, and that's really valuable. Knowing if something happens, your family's going to be okay. There's something really valuable. Helps you sleep. It helps you have a quality of life, knowing that you have that coverage. So even if you don't use the coverage, there's an intangible quality to carrying this type of insurance.
Yeah, no, to me, it's so funny because people will make that, what if I never use it? Well, you know, you
Congratulations.
buy homeowners insurance, you're probably not buying with the hope that your house burns down. I mean, that's sort of the worst situation. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's fascinating how, and again, you could probably write a book about some of the reasons why disability income sales continue to lag. In fact, one of the things you and I talked about before was I was recently at a meeting, IDIS, and the actuaries were congratulating the room on the fact that sales had increased 2.3% from the prior year. And I'm looking at that number, which was 454 million or something like that of sales in the prior year for individual disability income insurance. And I was like, what were we selling in 1986? Okay. It was more than double that. Okay. And the fact is
And the
that
population was less.
population has gone up 55, 60 million during that period of time. Issue and participation limits have gone from 10 to 35,000 for most of the larger IDI carriers. Incomes have gone up. All the reasons that the sales should be going like this. And we were congratulating ourselves on a 2.3% increase because the year before had been a negative increase. I love that. It's an oxymoron. Negative. It had been a negative number. And so the fact is that we should not be congratulating ourselves. We need more people that have passion and just talk about it with your clients. Bring it up in your annual reviews or your periodic reviews. Make sure that they haven't left one employer, open up a new company, and now they don't have that coverage from their prior employer, and they're a small group, and they and don't have a baseline of coverages, because most startup companies have very, very skinny programs for any type of insurance, let alone disability insurance. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to take a little break. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Bob Heron is going to tell us what the CDIA has built, what's free, what's available right now, and what someone listening to this can actually do before the end of May. All right, we're back with Bob Heron, president of the Council for Disability Income Awareness. Bob has been leading the rebuilding of this organization for the past 2.5 years. And now I want to talk about what the CDIA has actually built and how someone can use it. So you talked about all of these different resources. You have a library of free resources, fact sheets, blog content, social media tools, videos, available to any agent, advisor, or consumer. So tell us more about what is there and how people can access it.
Yeah, first off, the simplest way to access it is to go to thecdia.org. Okay, go on there. The first thing I'd like you to do is to sign up to get our periodic items that will come out from the CDIA. Right now, we're looking probably at 12 times a year. There'll be communication about what's new on the website, new tools that might have been dropped. You mentioned the videos. Those videos are available to be used in any way you want to. We charge agents and brokers no money for these. These things are all paid for through our members that support the CDIA. I've mentioned we're going to have even more tools in the future. I've mentioned there'll be additional videos. There'll be videos that are specifically designed for you to send to a potential customer. Oftentimes when I never purchased my own life insurance or disability, I always worked through an agent. I wanted that outside person communicating with me about what my needs might be. I was always reminded of the attorneys that died without a will. There's a lot of that out there. And so these are tools where it's, instead of you having to sell the individual, the person that maybe had a disability and is now being videoed about what he or she went through during their period of disability, short and long term. The fact that they can hear other people have the same types of thoughts. What would happen if I became disabled? What are those resources? And sort of get that person to understand that that's probably not going to do what they want to have done. You mentioned the blogs. We have a repository. I actually saw a number earlier. This was about a year old. We have 900 blog articles out there. They're all on the website. We've categorized them by year. And what we're now doing is cross-referencing so that an individual could have a specific issue, short-term, long-term, individual versus group. Those will be categorized so they can actually find those. So it's sort of third-party materials as opposed to sales materials that maybe a specific carrier might have. Something else that we've done, and this is available to member firms, is we're actually now doing, last year it was quarterly, this year will probably be 3 times, but we're actually doing some intense training on specific issues. Last year we talked about mental nervous parity in disability coverage. We talked about
what is mental nervous parity? What is mental nervous parity?
Well, most carriers, most products out there still have a 2-year limitation on mental nervous drug alcohol. But over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a huge improvement in the diagnosis and treatment of those types of things. And so, and for instance, in Canada, there is no limitation on those types of products. So it's really something born out of the United States back when it was, I think, much more difficult to get good, clean analysis of what the issue might be. And so the question is, should there be mental nervous parity in the products? And we're not advocating that there should be, but we are pointing out that there are a lot more tools out there. And the fact that by early interdiction into a mental nervous drug alcohol claim, you could probably have a better outcome. Okay. And so instead of having a policy that is focused, or the individual's focused on the fact that they only have coverage for the first 2 years, is let's get the person back to work, get them into appropriate care, and work with them in a residual or a partial disability, because there's also a realization that when the person comes out of the workforce, so much of their identity is tied to being in the workforce. And by getting them and continuing to have them work, be surrounded by their peers and colleagues, their prognosis is much better than what would have been in the past. So, but again, the other one that we did that was incredibly popular was about Social Security. One of the things that's been interesting about Social Security are the differences between states as far as approval rates. Okay. SSDI is a federal program, but is there some reason that most states are in their 20s and 30% approval rates, and some states are in the 60s and 70% approval?
So it's really not the same. Wow.
And federal programs probably shouldn't look like that. And so we actually had experts from SSDI, former individuals that were in leadership positions, talking about how they're trying to improve the system statewide across the enterprise, but also we're showing the differences in approval rates and the amount of time it takes to file. And again, trying to get to raise the level of support from SSDI, because we all pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that, and there's a lot of concern right now, how long will it survive? What's the money situation? And interestingly enough, on the disability side, the SSDI is actually funded through almost the end of this century. It's on the retirement side.
Retirement, yes.
And, we keep kicking the can down the road and not taking on some of the core issues on that.
So you've been working in this space since 1986, and after nearly 40 years watching what happens when people are covered and when they aren't, what would you most want a working American to understand before this month, Disability Insurance Awareness Month, is over?
What I want them to understand and query is a realistic understanding of their situation. Okay. I'm somewhat anal retentive, but I have a monthly document that shows me how I'm sitting. It has all of my insurances on there. It has my resources, my IRAs or 401ks, different types of things. And I've done that for 30, 35, probably 40 years. To me, it's a great comfort for me to understand where I'm sitting, and also to be aware of what mitigating circumstances could happen that would take me off stride. Okay. And for years and years, I was on the road. I'm one of those individuals that has over 1,700 nights in Marriott's, and they send you a little card saying, congratulations. And all I did was I divided that number by 365, and I figured out that I had been on the road 6 years out of my life, basically, away from spouse and child and things like that. But if people would be honest and look at what they have, and then understand that insurance is there when bad things happen to people, and none of us gets to choose. Carol passed from cancer. It was, she'd had it, went in remission, came back. Those types of things happen. And so my desire has always been, I want people to understand what you have in case something doesn't, your plan gets off track, and understand that your kids can still go to the same school. You can stay in the same house. You're going to go through some tough times, because there's no disability that does not impact your mental and physical abilities. But the fact is that you have the monies to keep the life that you have currently at some level continue, and not be surprised by, boy, I wish my agent had talked to me about that. Boy, I wish I had, read that brochure a little more. And my other goal would be that every agent that goes through a process with their client asks the questions. Get that person to, if they don't understand what they have, help them understand what they have. Understand how good it is. I applaud employers that have strong benefit programs for their employees. The other thing that I want people to understand is, even if your employer does not provide the group coverage, there are other outlets. One of the things I've endeavored to do since I came on board was to recognize the role of the Aflacs and the Colonials, the American Fidelities, the worksite products. Those are oftentimes the only options available in the smaller employers. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the employer sponsors the program, suddenly there's discounts, underwriting concessions, things like that. So there's lots of different ways to approach this issue, depending on whether you work for IBM or work for Bob Herum tire sales. Okay, there are different options that are available. But make the conscious decision to understand it And then if you're going to take the risk, take that risk consciously, not unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that was very well said. I think the CDIA is very fortunate you're in the right place at the right time to really help this organization. I can tell you are extremely passionate about this. It's something that you live and breathe, which I find very admirable. So I really, I hope we can help the organization any way we can and spread the awareness and help as many people as possible. So thank you for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamie. Loved the conversation. Spread the word.
Absolutely.
From the Income Protection Journal, you've been listening to the Income Protection Journal podcast with Jamie Fleischner.